Got this on? Terrific. Hi, everyone. Welcome to NYU, and welcome to the Brennan Center for Justice program. I'm Victoria Bassetti, a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with NYU School of Law. If anyone has tuned into television in the last few days, you know we live in very challenging political times. I can't remember a time when the word devastating has been used quite so much. Some people would say that fundamental institutions of our democracy now respond to narrow interests rather than the wants and needs of our citizens. The American people are divided. Our political campaigns are awash in money, foreign influence, and the inclusive civic culture of our nation that should support the civil participation of all American citizens is being challenged on every front. So what are the democratic norms, the legal guardrails, the laws that are needed to shore up our democracy? Tonight, we're really lucky to have Professor Lawrence Lessig here to help us answer these questions. He is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School, host of the podcast Another Way, founder of EqualCitizens.us, or US, and co-founder of Creative Commons. I could go on and on about what Professor Lessig has done, but it might take up almost the entire hour for me to go through everything that he's accomplished. He's here to talk tonight about his new book, They Don't Represent Us, Reclaiming Our Democracy, in which he calls for significant reforms, including public campaign financing, funding, a reformed electoral college, and a nationwide ban on partisan gerrymandering. So welcome, Professor Lessig.
Thank you for having me.
So the title of your book has two pretty loaded words, more than two loaded words, but I want to start off asking you about what is the meaning of two of them. First of all, who are they?
Yeah, so there are two theys. One they is they, the government. That's the more obvious one, the one that flows from the work I've been doing for the last 12 years about our unrepresentative democracy. And in some sense, it's a simpler problem to solve, at least conceptually, not politically, but conceptually. But the second they really refers to the they as in the they it is said to represent us, as in us. So we don't represent us. And that's the second part of the book, which is something new and I think the most difficult problem, which is to describe the way in which our media or cultural environment has evolved to a place where how we are represented can't be said properly to be representing us. And that's devastating, I think. Oh, we used that word. There we go. For the health of democracy, because the belief that we have in this institution of democracy, in some sense, hangs on us having confidence in us. But when we're rendered in this ridiculous, polarized, ignorant way, it weakens the confidence that we might have in us.
So we have met the enemy, and they are us.
They are us. But of course, so I'm a little anxious that hangs there because it makes it sound like I'm against us. Kind of bad to be against us, at least with a lot of people in the room. So I'm not saying I'm against us. What I'm saying is I'm against the way we are represented. So one response to this might be to say, get rid of democracy, let's have a bunch of elites, or we call them technocrats. I'm absolutely opposed to that. I have a deep belief in the capacity for us to be represented in a way which would be edifying and normatively powerful and inspiring, but we just don't do it.
You know, I think one of the interesting things about the book is that book that discusses the they as us and understanding and kind of diagnoses and goes through the way our civic culture and our media culture today has altered or changed the notion of they and us. And I think maybe it would be really helpful for people to hear a little bit more about what you think about how our media landscape and our civic landscape has changed to alter that sort of confidence that we once had as a civic we.
Yeah, I mean, so what's striking about where we are is that we are colored by a weird period in human history. A period that Marcus Pryor of Princeton would refer to as broadcast democracy. So there's a period of circa 1950 to 1985 in America when we understand the world through a technology of broadcast television. There's a small number of channels. It's in some sense irresistible. We have to turn the TV on. Every day at the same time, there's news. The news is generally kind of right down the middle. Now, I don't want to praise what the news says. I don't want to say it's unbiased or it's complete or it's critical in the right ways. It's none of those things, but it is a common story that we understand. And what Marcus Pryor's work demonstrates is the way in which it radically changes politics. Because as everybody begins to understand essentially the same thing, more people feel like they know something, and so more people get engaged in politics. And the percentage of people all across the range who are actually going out and voting is as high as it's been, at least since we stopped buying votes in the 19th century. But that period is also a period when we begin to learn how to read the people. Like polling isn't born really until 1935 in a really substantial way. And so there's this coincidence of, at the same time that we begin to learn how to read we the people have something interesting to say, because we're actually informed and understand, and you can map the evolution of really important issues like civil rights or the war in Vietnam or Nixon or the environment as being driven really by this exposure, common exposure to this fundamental set of facts. Now, this broadcast democracy period is very different from the period before. Let's say, just pick the 19th century. Because in the 19th century, people get access to the news through newspapers. The newspapers are partisan and fragmented. So the public is constructed through this fragmented partisan source. But the difference between that period and the broadcast democracy period is that you couldn't see the public back then. Right? The public's not legible. The public expresses itself in voting, and we elect representatives, but public policy finds its expression through the elected representatives, through this elite, not through some tapping into ordinary people. Okay, so shift to the present. In one sense, we've returned to the 19th century, because once again, our media is fragmented and partisan. It's a tool to rally people to one side or another. But the difference with the 19th century is that we can now see us. We're now visible. We get called on the phone and we ask questions, we give our views, whether we know anything or not. What do we think of NAFTA? Should there be thorium reactors? We give our views, and that in some sense is said to speak for the people. And it feels natural to say that it speaks for the people, because in the broadcast democracy period, we weren't so embarrassing when we would say these things about those issues that we happened to be polled about, at least the ones that were related to national issues. And so the we that we now construct and see is very different from the we that was constructed during this period of broadcast democracy. And I fear that the incompleteness or the partisan or the polarized worlds that we now are very difficult to inspire us as we think about who the people have become.
And we were talking before we came up here about the impeachment hearings, which we've been watching or listening to over the course of the last 2 weeks. And I think I said to you, having watched many of these witnesses over the course of the last 10 days or 7 hearings, I was so consistently struck by the sincerity, the intelligence, what struck me as being the honesty of all of these witnesses. And I couldn't imagine that someone couldn't see the same thing, and yet they don't.
Right.
And how do we come back to the era or the time when we can all see these hearings and come to a consensus or come to a similar conclusion? Are we hopelessly fractured?
We are never going back to that period. It's never going to happen. And what we have to ask is, how do we run a democracy recognizing we're never going to be in the 1970s again? Now, for many reasons, that's a great thing. I mean, when you turn to the Culture Channel, what we've evolved is extraordinary, incredible. The diversity, the reach, the creativity, it's like unimaginable compared to the 1970s. So on that dimension, it's a wonderful time. It's a very Dickensian moment, right? It's the best of times and the worst of times. On that channel, it's the best of times. But when you turn to the Democracy Channel, it's the worst of times. And that's because I think in some sense we've developed the instincts about how to run a democracy from the technologies of the broadcast era, and we haven't yet updated or figured out how to update it. It's a profound consequence. I mean, the impeachment's a great historical example because we've got three relevant impeachments we could talk about. Think about Johnson, who's impeached at the time when media is fragmented and polarized, but the public is invisible. So what we know is how the elite responds. They, of course, understand all the facts, and there's a story about how they come to their conclusion of within one vote impeaching that president. Brenda Wineapple's fantastic book unpacks that story in a way that makes understandable how they come to that without even having to assume that they were bribed, but they could have been bribed, so who knows? But the point is, it's a story of a public watching at a distance and then manifesting their views 6 months later in an election. Nixon is impeached at the height of broadcast democracy. And the striking thing about Nixon is, the polling that looks at Republicans and Democrats, of course, find Republicans loving Nixon and Democrats hating Nixon. So 83% of Republicans approve of Nixon, kind of the same as Trump. And 50-some Democrats approve of Nixon, higher than Trump. But if you look at the way those numbers move, they move almost with perfect correlation. And so at the moment, 6 months before Nixon resigns, his support begins to collapse, but it collapses in the same way for both sides. And that's because everybody's watching the same story. And of course, you react differently depending on whether you're on the right or on your left, but you can't help but react to that story. Today, if you look at these polls about support for Trump or support for among Republicans or Democrats, there's no correlation. There's a complete flat line. It's just unconnected. And the reality, Barack Obama about 2 months ago said that if you watch Fox News, you live in a different reality from if you read the New York Times. A different reality. And the point is that different reality reinforces itself. So it is true, you can't imagine how people can look at those witnesses and see anything other than integrity. And that's the problem, that you can't imagine it. And I can't either. I really feel so far away because I do live in this world and they live in that world, and I don't really want to live in their world. I don't want to, go back to, I don't want to live in a sort of Fox News reality. But it's a challenge for a democracy when we understand that gap exists. And, and you could, the president was completely wrong to retweet the southern pastor who said there would be a civil war if the president was impeached. He was completely wrong to do that. But there's something to the comparison, because the Civil War, in some sense, is another moment where we lived in these totally different cultural environments. I mean, the law forbid sending material to the South about, abolitionist material to the South. So we had these bubbles of understanding, and they couldn't understand us, we couldn't understand them. I'm presuming I'm from the North here. My mom actually was from the South, so I don't know who I am. But the point is, I'm going to take the North side here. We didn't understand them, they didn't understand us. And, that was pretty tragic, the consequences of that. But I feel like in some sense, this is the nature of our problem now. But different from them, we present our craziness now every single day when the pollings reveal who we are and what we think.
So I want to read a passage from the book. that I think is relevant to the conversation we were just having. So you begin, the question now is how to build a democracy that does not assume that we all at any particular time know anything, and that accepts that what's told to us is told to us with a partisan spin. How do we govern ourselves when we in fact know squat about even the most important issues? How do we run a democracy when the people are inherently ignorant and when we, the ignorant, live in tribes? There is an answer to that question. I think maybe it starts in Mongolia.
Yes, it starts in Mongolia, right. So I had this bizarre experience in May of 2017 of being in Mongolia because Mongolia passed a law, and the law said that before the Mongolian parliament is allowed to consider an amendment to its constitution, it has to conduct something called a deliberative poll. So what that means is they have to select a random representative selection of Mongolians and bring them to Ulaanbaatar, and they occupy the parliament for 4 days as they deliberate about this poll. So the first morning I'm there, and this huge parliament building, and there's stairs, and there's 700 Mongolians, and there's Genghis Khan and this huge statue behind. And you look at this mix, and it is a perfect representation of Mongolia. It's slightly more women than men, not a bad way to be wrong, but the point is it's rich and poor, it's urban, rural, it's professional, blue collar in the way we would think about it. Half those people had been on a bus for 2 days to get to Mongolia, to get to Ulaanbaatar. They had been drafted, essentially. And Mongolia is not a place where people kind of feel free to say no when the government says show up, so they show up. And so then I'm listening to this deliberation about this constitutional question, which was a complicated constitutional question, and I think I'm a law professor from Harvard. These people will never be able to understand this. It's too complicated for them. But over the course of the time that I listened to them, I was astonished with the depth and sincerity and earnestness with which they struggled with this. And in the end, they came to an incredibly sensible solution, conclusion about it. And this convinced me in a visceral sense of something that I'd known of forever and I believed in forever, but never believed in as much as then. Because what I think this was practicing, Jim Fishkin is the one who developed deliberative polls, and he runs them everywhere for the last 30 years. And uniformly, they have this kind of flavor to them, but I've never been there to see it. I think what it demonstrated was that, in fact, if you construct us in a certain way, or maybe it's not us, maybe it's just Mongolians, but let's assume it's general. If you construct us in the right way, and you give us information, and you give us a chance to reflect and think about it, and it is representative, so it's not like all of the partisans on one side and all the partisans on the other. I mean, there will be partisans, but it turns out those are a relatively small slice of any public. And they have to confront each other in small groups and in big groups. We can be so much more than we are when we live in our tiny little universes with our phones, and then we get called or summoned to answer a question, and then we give a result as a process of that. So the sense in which it begins in Mongolia is to say, there's a way we can be represented that we should be proud of, we should celebrate. And then once you realize that, think about the other public officers in our type of republic. The Republican, small r Republican tradition says being a citizen is to be a public officer. Okay, well, the thing about other public officers is none of them have to answer quizzes. When the president speaks, before this president, maybe it's a better point, but you'll get the point of the generic idea. The president speaks, he doesn't just blather, right? He doesn't just, this, again, I'm not talking about the current, I'm saying when we understand the president speaking, we understand the president speaks, and when he says something, what he's saying is the product of a whole bunch of deliberation by a bunch of people who've given him the information on both sides and the political issue on both sides, and he takes a stand, and that's to be respected as the stand of the president, whether you like it or not. When the Supreme Court says something, if you walked up to Elena Kagan and you quizzed her about admiralty law, she would be perfectly within her rights to say, look, if you want to get a question about admiralty law answered, then what you do is you get a case and you write some briefs and you give us a chance to hear an argument and then we'll deliberate and write an opinion, and that's our view of admiralty law. Or even a jury, right? You can't walk into a jury midway through its deliberations and take a poll and say, that's the view of the jury. The jury is supposed to be a process for coming to a result, and at the end of that process, then it gets to speak. Every one of these aspects of our public life get a process, and most of them get staff, except us. We get quizzed. We're supposed to do our own work. We're supposed to have, done the deliberation with people we don't agree with and come to an understanding that's reflective and informed. And I feel this kind of sense of outrage. Why do we allow this insult to be perpetrated? Because why are we accepting us being represented in the worst possible way? Yet that's what we do. And so part of what I'm trying to do is just reorient our sense of what can we expect from the pop quiz public, because it's just as good as what you would expect from the pop quiz Supreme Court justice or the pop quiz jury or the pop quiz president, which we seem to have. But the point is, this is a difference that is about conceiving of us differently as much as it is about building institutions or building new devices called deliberative polls.
And there's so much rich in this book that we really don't have the time to go into all of it, but I want to ask you about what you call slow democracy.
Right.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, so I'm sure many people here know of the slow food movement. So slow food movement says, given the nature of our bodies and the way we work, if you want to be healthy in what you eat, you should just cook your food and eat it slowly with friends talking over a table for a long time. And if you do that, if you cook your food and you eat with friends and you eat over a long period of time, the consequence of that will be healthy nutrition for you. Because you can't screw up food you cook as much as processed food is screwed up. It's hard to make as much poison yourself as the processed food industry is able to do. They have magic and you don't. So it'll turn out on balance, it'll be healthy, and that's just it's a feature of our body and the way it is. What I'm arguing in this part of the book is that we need a slow democracy movement where we recognize that we're good at thinking about democratic ideas in certain contexts and bad in others. So I've become an enormous fan of podcasting. Right? So podcasting, I was on the Joe Rogan podcast, 2.5 hours into the podcast, I looked up and realized it's 2.5 hours that we've been talking. And the data about podcasting is astonishing, that the people listen for an incredible period of time. They'll listen for an hour or 2 hours. His numbers say that people 80% listen all the way to the end of his 2.5 hour long podcast. And when you're listening to a conversation, and it's just the nature of us, we're good at beginning to reflect as we listen to a conversation over time. And we hear both sides and we begin to feel pulled in one way or another. And in that context, we do the process of reflecting well, as opposed to Twitter or our Facebook feed, which is, our Facebook feed is like a spiked drink. It is architected to render us crazy. It is because the crazier it can make you, the more you reveal, the better the data they have is about you. The better the data they have about you, the better the ads are that they can sell, right? I mean, it's kind of astonishing to recognize, but it is the business model of advertising layered on top of social media that renders social media so poisonous. I mean, I don't think we have good data to know what social media without advertising would look like. I mean, it might be harmful, it might be innocuous, I don't know. But we know that with advertising, this platform becomes tweaked to drive us into behaviors that we otherwise wouldn't want to be doing because it helps sell ads. And sometimes when you think about this, I remember having a conversation with somebody and I was describing this, he said, okay, wait a minute. If you told me that you destroyed democracy to end climate change, I wouldn't be for that, but I would kind of get the trade-off. Or, we're going to destroy democracy so that we can end world hunger. Okay, I mean, that would be terrible, but at least I'd get why you're... But the idea you're destroying democracy to make Mark Zuckerberg richer, this is just not comprehensible, yet this is in a certain sense what we have done without even intending it. I don't think there's any evil force, the Google boys or Mark Zuckerberg trying to say, oh, here's how we can destroy America's democracy. It's just, wow, here is a business model that's going to make us enormously successful, enormously rich. And oops, turns out it has this really horrible consequence, at least in contexts where we need people to be something other than little rats that we've wired up and turned into crazy people.
So we started off this conversation with the hard part.
Yeah.
And now I want to turn to
the easy part, yeah.
what you described in an earlier interview, the easy part, which is reforming our campaign finance system, ending gerrymandering, implementing ranked choice voting, rethinking the Senate, which you call a conceptual mess, redoing the way we elect a president, and maybe a little bit of alteration about how we treat voters in our law. So that's the easy stuff. So that's what we're going to turn to now, the easy stuff. So why don't we, this goes to the heart of one of those second loaded terms in the title of your book, represent. And why don't you tell us quickly about the proposition in your book about they don't represent us, and then we don't have time to go through all of the things, but there are a few that I want to call out that are very Brennan-centery.
Yeah. So, you'll often be in an argument with people about our quote-unquote democracy, and they'll scream at you, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic. Okay, so the first thing is, yes, that's true. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. So if a Ford truck is a truck, then we have a democracy, right? So, but let's take that word seriously. A representative democracy. It's kind of built into the title. It's supposed to be representative, right? That's the idea. And the first part of the book is trying to describe the dimensions of our institutions of democracy that are inherently unrepresentative. That have evolved to be inherently unrepresentative. So, for example, the simplest and most obvious. States are allowed to administer their voting systems in a way that makes it harder for some group to vote than for others. That typically expresses itself in a way that is racial. So Georgia, it's hard to look at Georgia and not think these are white people trying to keep black people from voting. The more fundamental way of understanding it is partisan. It's the insiders, the Republicans, who are trying to make it harder for the Democrats to vote, and it turns out the tweaks to make it harder for Democrats to vote are tweaks that impact African-American Democrats more directly or obviously than others. So there's something crazy about the idea that we allow a system of voting to be administered so that some people have more freedom to vote than others do, but we do. And the consequence of that is an unrepresentativeness or an inequality in the ability to vote. Or take gerrymandering. So gerrymandering, of course, politicians picking their voters rather than voters picking their politicians. The way gerrymandering in Congress works is that states draw districts for the purpose of maximizing, quote unquote, safe seats. So probably 85% of seats are safe seats. What a safe seat is a seat where we know the party that will win. So if you're in a safe seat Democratic district, you know a Republican is not going to beat you. But you also know a Democrat could beat you. You could be beaten in the primary. So if you're in a safe seat Democratic district, you're concerned about an even more progressive Democrat who might beat you in a primary. Or if you're in a safe seat Republican district, you're concerned about an even more right-wing Republican who could defeat you. Because the thing about primaries is that it's the extremes who vote in the primaries. Okay, what that means is in 85% of the districts, representatives are constantly focused to their flank, either to the right if they're a Republican or left if they're a Democrat, which means that those views get amplified inside of the political system. So that the views of people in the middle, or the views of a Republican in a Democratic district, views of a Democrat-Republican district, get suppressed. In that sense, there's that inequality. Or think about the Electoral College. We have the impression that the United States of America selects our president. It actually turns out that we've delegated that choice to a country called Swing State America. Swing State America is about 14 states. It's not quite contiguous. There are a couple jumps, but they're pretty, like, you can draw a line through most of them. Swing State America just happens to be the most purple states in America. But because all but 2 states allocate their electors proportionally, winner take all, the strategy for running for president is to only spend time in swing states in America. So in 2016, 99% of campaign spending was in 14 states. Okay, now, if Swing State America represented America, we could say, okay, that's a good way to economize. They can do the work, and we can just relax and not have to watch ads on television for presidential candidates. But of course, Swing State America does not represent America. It is older, it is whiter, its industry is kind of late 19th century industry. There are 7.5 times the number of people in America working in solar energy as mine coal. But you don't hear about solar energy in presidential elections because those people live in Texas and in California, non-swing states. You hear about coal mining because coal mining is within the swing state belt. So the point is, this delegation to a country to select our president that doesn't represent us makes no sense. Yet we've done that. And if we were going to delegate to a country, I'd say, why not to, Sweden? That would be a better country to delegate to. I'd be more happy about, but the point is, there's no representative justification for that. And then finally, the most obvious, the one that I've spent 10 of the last 12 years of my life obsessing about, the way we fund campaigns. Like, we have a system where candidates for Congress spend 30 to 70% of their time, 30 to 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or get their party back into power. But they raise that money not by randomly calling the average American, right? They raise that money by calling no more than about 150,000 Americans who are the people who give money to these kinds of campaigns. But those 150,000 Americans, this tiny, tiny fraction of the 1%, in no sense represent us, but they have enormous power inside of this political system. So when you add all of these dimensions of unrepresentativeness up together, in general, this is the simple point, they don't represent us because they're representing all of these fractionally powerful entities much more than the others in each of these dimensions. But one interesting conclusion from that is, I don't know how to aggregate it all together, but one thing that follows is, it's not actually that it's the plutocracy that's winning in each of those fights. I mean, in the money to run elections dimension, certainly it's rich people who are winning, no doubt. But in partisan gerrymandering, I mean, it's the extremes. Doesn't necessarily correlate directly with wealth. In Republican southern states that are making it harder for Democrats to vote in those states, that's not necessarily wealth. These are not rich places. The Electoral College, swing states are not richer on average. There's no wealth dimension there. So what's interesting is this is not so much a system designed to make the plutocrats win. I actually think it might be better if it were a system designed to make the plutocrats win, because at least there would be a plan. Like, it would be a comprehensive sort of coherent plan. Instead, our system is more like vultures feeding on a dead water buffalo. Like nobody wins. I mean, nobody wins systematically. And so the consequence together is not that we're being steered in a direction we don't want, it's that we're not being steered. It is our government cannot function. This broken institution, this failed branch within our Constitution, the Congress, essentially cannot deal with any issue in a sensible way. Because of this endemic, this systematic system of unrepresentativeness.
So as I said, the book is rich with ideas, many of them legislative, but I want to, because we're at a law school, I think I'd like, for the moment, to focus maybe on a little bit of litigation. Okay. And the first one I want to talk about is, I think, teeing off of something that you write in your book, which is that lawyers and judges just can't stop looking for corruption in all the wrong places. And we've had a lot of talk about quid pro quos recently. But you're not so interested in quid pro quo. You're interested in a different version or vision or understanding of corruption, and you're kind of maybe putting it to the test in
Yep.
Alaska.
Right.
So
Why not?
why
Right.
don't we, I'm really curious about it because it's strategic litigation undertaken with a view towards maybe bringing it to the Supreme Court, which has been really kind of whittling away at their vision of or understanding of corruption over the course of the last 20 years. You want to take it straight to the Supreme Court. Tell
Right.
us more
So-
about it.
So the Supreme Court has said Congress or a government can regulate political speech if it has a compelling interest, and the compelling interest it's recognized so far as quote-unquote corruption. But by corruption, it's spoken increasingly sharply about just quid pro quo corruption. You can think of that as individual corruption. So if you're trying to regulate individual corruption in some way, then it's okay to restrict political speech. But nothing beyond that has earned the justification from the Supreme Court. But I think that, not I just me, obviously, but I think there's another kind of corruption that is maybe even more important, especially in a mature democracy like ours, which is not individual corruption, but institutional corruption. Not the acts of individuals breaking the rules, but institutions that become unconnected to an institutional purpose. So think about our Congress. Madison said we would have a Congress that would be filled with people who would be, quote, dependent on the people alone, okay? The people alone. And he envisioned that dependency to express itself through regular, every 2-year elections in districts that were to be small so that they would feel that dependency on the people alone. But we know we've evolved a system for funding campaigns that creates a different dependence, a dependence on these funders. And that dependence on the funders is obviously not a dependence on the people, because the funders aren't the people. So this is a corruption of the intended dependence that our framers had for Congress. So it's a corruption of the institution, even if nobody in Congress engages in quid pro quo bribery. Okay, so I, this is something Zephyr Teachout in her really wonderful book, Corruption in America, really makes the argument powerfully with historical understanding, and I was inspired by that book in my own book, Republic Lost, to sort of map this as a way of thinking about the corruption argument. But the key here is to get somebody who is motivated to understand this kind of corruption as relevant to the question of corruption under the First Amendment. And it turns out that this conception of corruption that's focused on institutions, is the conception that our framers were most obsessed with. The framers of our Constitution, though they talked about bribery, we've done a study of all the times they've ever spoken of the word corrupt, they used the word corruption or spoke of corruption there. Though they were talking about bribery sometimes, most of the time they were talking about institutional corruption. That's the thing they were most obsessed with. So from an originalist perspective, you would say an originalist has no good reason to limit Congress's ability to deal with quote-unquote corruption to this exceptional kind of corruption, quid pro quo corruption, when the framers were so deeply focused on giving Congress the ability to regulate institutional corruption. That was their focus. Okay, so how do you get originalists to think about this? Well, it turns out Alaska has a law that says if the Election Commission does not enforce the law, citizens can complain. So we found some citizens in Alaska who wanted to complain about the fact that Alaska had stopped enforcing their super PAC law. And we went to Alaska, they filed their case, the Alaska Election Commission said, of course we can't enforce our super PAC law, because this decision by the DC Circuit in a case called Speech Now basically says super PACs are constitutionally protected. So we can't enforce the law. And we responded to that in the district court by saying, look, the DC Circuit's opinion is not binding on you. The only thing that could be binding on you is the United States Supreme Court. So count the votes in the United States Supreme Court. We have 4 votes, plainly to say that super PACs can be regulated. So the question is how the others will vote. We know that there are originalists on that court. Indeed, right now, a very importantly young originalist, Justice Gorsuch, who, I think is a genuine originalist. He's also a conservative, but a genuine originalist, trying to figure out what originalist doctrine means. So we said to the court, let us prove to you the original understanding, and then you add up the votes, and you see whether you think at least one of those remaining justices would vote with the 4 to uphold the ability to regulate super PACs. So the court said, fine. We took Jack Rakoff, one of the great American historians of that period, up to Alaska. We spent 4 hours testifying to the judge, going through the whole of the original understanding, and it took a year, but the court finally gave us an opinion, astonished us. The court agreed with us, said we were right. It's important to our strategy that we lose at every level so we could move it quickly, but it was said it was right. So then we had to persuade the Election Commission to appeal that to the Alaska Supreme Court, and I found out today that they've agreed. They're going to appeal it to the Alaska Supreme Court, and we hope to lose in the Alaska Supreme Court quickly. And then we'll go for cert to the United States Supreme Court. And if the liberals on the court are paying attention, they'll realize that the whole of our case is going to be a case focused on the originalists. We want to make a good faith argument to the originalists that says good faith originalism should lead you to leave Congress with the discretion to regulate what is properly conceived of as institutional corruption. And those 4 can grant cert and then allow us to go argue to 1 or 2 justices in the Supreme Court. And, I think there's a 10% chance we win. But the thing about 10% is it's about 100 times greater than any other solution to super PACs succeeding right now in America. So this is it's a bank shot, but it's in good faith, and I think it's right, and I think there's no reason in the world they should want to resist us because this is another example of can we really understand them. I clerked for Scalia. I think I understood Scalia a bit. I'll tell you a secret about you can't tell anybody this, but the last lunch I had with Scalia, I had this argument with him. The lunch started with me saying, you've ruined me as a law professor. And he kind of said, why? And I said, well, when I clerked for you, there's all sorts of cases where there was the originalist thing to do and the conservative thing to do. And we always convinced you to do the originalist thing, your principled thing. And so when I left and became a law professor, whenever I'd see a case where there was a conflict between the conservative thing and the originalist thing, I'd say, oh, Scalia's going to do the originalist thing, and you let me down every single time. And then the time that I talked about was the McCutcheon case, which was the most recent time they considered the meaning of corruption. And in the course of the lunch, I laid out the original understanding of corruption. And, he had a lot to drink over the course of the lunch, so I don't really want to put a lot of argument on this, but by the end he said, I think you might be right. I don't know how I could resist the argument that I've got to allow them to regulate what you're calling institutional corruption. And then he died. Not at that lunch, but shortly afterwards. So I was convinced, if I could get this originalist, a really smart, convinced originalist, to see it's at least plausible, I was convinced that it's the right thing to do, and what we hope to do is to recruit a Randy Barnett kind of originalist to make the argument in the Supreme Court, because it's not a trick. It's take them seriously for their philosophy, and if that's seriously their philosophy as it reads on this, it should allow us to do what all of them must believe Congress should have the power to do, because nobody can look at this system and say it's a good system when 10 billionaires can direct and control exactly what our Congress does.
So we're gonna turn to audience questions shortly. So if you're considering, start thinking about the questions that you might want to ask, and we'll be taking them at a mic towards the front of the room over there. But before we do that, I want to ask you one last question, which is about the case that you've currently got before the Supreme Court. You filed for a writ a few weeks ago, about a month ago, and maybe we'll know at the beginning of next year, or possibly in December, unclear, regarding presidential electors and their ability to cast their vote of conscience. In other words, to ignore, if they want, the popular vote of the state in which they are electors. And that's another significant portion of what you discuss, which is the way our presidential election system is is what shall we call it? Unrepresentative. So why don't you quickly, if you can, tell us a little bit about that litigation, and then we'll turn to audience questions.
So we are, so this group Equal Citizens is deeply focused on how do we get reform in the Electoral College. But of course, in the last election, there were a significant number of electors who voted contrary to their pledge. And at that stage, I thought, this should not be a question that's decided in the course of an actual presidential election. So after the election, we approached electors in Washington who had been fined $1,000 because they voted contrary to their pledge, and electors in Colorado, one of whom was kicked off, and 2 others who were threatened. And we said, let us resolve this question. Now, when I originally did it, I wanted to do it simply for the purpose of resolving it outside of a presidential contest, because whatever way you go, it would be the worst thing in the world for the Supreme Court. This would be Bush v. Gore raised to the 10th, right? It would be the worst thing in the world for the court to have to decide it when they're deciding who's going to be chosen. And you know, if you think of like 2000, where there's just 2 votes that separate the winner from the loser, it's not implausible that an elector motivated after 2016 could make that shift and go the other way. The more I'm into this case, which I'm now deeply, I feel like the world's expert now on this issue, the more I'm absolutely convinced there's no way this court is going to be able to write an opinion that says anything other than, yes, electors are free to vote their conscience. And I think that will terrify most people. On the left or the right, this is not a political issue, it will just terrify us. The idea we have this institution where if it comes down to the wire, 1 or 2 people flipping their vote could change the presidency is just not acceptable, right? So, or maybe it is. I mean, we should decide whether we like it or not. And if we don't like it, then that's motivating the alternatives that, you know, could actually be alternatives that we are happy with. The simplest one is the National Popular Vote Compact, which would create enough of a buffer that it would never matter. But we're actually trying to push for an amendment. We've been litigating another set of cases to try to get the court to say, as a matter of equal protection, you should allocate electors proportionally, not winner take all. But I think the ultimate solution that, in fact, you should be able to get agreement on is keep the number of electors as they are, but allocate electors proportionally at the fractional level. And if you did that, then every state would matter, every state would be in play. Like, it'd be just as much to get a vote out of Wyoming as it would be to get a vote out of Texas. So it would solve this kind of weird swing state America problem. It wouldn't be, from my perspective, the best solution, because it's not one person, one vote. You still have more power in Wyoming than you do in California. But the reality of a constitution that requires 3/4 of the states to agree to an amendment is, I think, that in some sense, until the revolution, we're stuck with this inequality.
So if anyone has any questions, why don't you think about coming up, and you need to come up to the mic if you want to ask your questions. Yeah. And if I can ask that you give us your name and tell us before you ask your question.
Yes. My name's Hugh Campbell. I'm a certified public accountant. And in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt gave a speech called The Right of the People to Rule. And he talked about a lot of political reform. And one of the reforms that he advocated was a national referendum in the case of controversial Supreme Court decisions. If we had a national referendum on controversial Supreme Court decisions, let's say 5-4s, that required a supermajority of 56% to overturn that Supreme Court decision, what are your thoughts?
So I don't like the idea. I don't like the idea for all the kind of information reasons that I described in the first part of our talk. So then the question might be, well, what about a deliberative poll? And then you're forcing me to reveal a kind of non-democratic feeling I have about legal questions, which is, I think if you're a lawyer, you recognize some legal questions actually take some experience to understand the significance of those legal questions or why they get decided in a particular way. So I would not be excited about opening up the court's decisions to a review either by an informed and reflective public, general public, or certainly a referendum that anybody could be voting at. It's a problem we have with our court right now, that it is relatively activist compared to historically. And so this issue becomes more and more pressing the more things that it does. But I think I feel cornered as a, this is my limit. I feel cornered as a lawyer to say that I don't think, in general, legal questions like this can be opened, especially when they touch civil rights like that.
Early on in your talk, you characterized Supreme Court decisions and also pre-Trump presidential addresses as having a deliberative quality, and you omitted Congress. I'm old enough to remember the Watergate hearings, which were really the impeachment inquiry for Richard Nixon. And there, it really was a deliberative process. There wasn't this phenomenon of one party attacking the people who testified, trying to make them look bad, but it was a real inquiry, and deliberative and respectable and respect-worthy. And yet now it isn't. And is it your view that the main things that made Congress deteriorate to the way it is and has been in the last decade or so was internet plus fracturing of the news media? Those two things?
Imagine being Ben Sasse, who's a very reflectful. I mean, I'm not like his politics, but I'm saying, he's reflective, he's serious.
Yeah.
I think he has an understanding that is complex, and I can't imagine that he's happy with the head of his party. But he lives in a place where his public is happy with the head of his party. And that fact is visible to him 24/7. He gets a memo every single morning from the party telling him what polling numbers look like, right? And so he's constantly in this position where he needs to decide who he's going to be. Is he going to be a representative of something more than merely what the polls say, or is he going to be the representative of what the polls say? And so this is a backwards way to get around to saying, I do think that the problem I was describing about us makes it harder for them to be the people that you were referring to when you were talking about representatives at the height of broadcast democracy. So I do think it's harder. But I omitted Congress, and I didn't mean to omit Congress in this sense. I mean, I also think Congress, they can be partisan, but they also come to understand things in some sense when they're not so much in our face, that's reflecting both sides and exposed to both sides, at least more than we are. Now, the other thing I would tie this to is money. If you're spending half your time raising money, and the reality is to raise money, the best way to raise money is to vilify the other side. The more you can spew hate on the other side, the more likely you are to inspire money back to you. So if you spend half your time vilifying the other side, and the other half of your time on Fox News or MSNBC vilifying the other side, it's really hard to turn around and put your arm around somebody and say, let's work stuff out. It's just psychologically hard. So I think these things are connected, but I have real empathy, maybe, I don't know, but I understand the pressure. I want to say to people, stand up and be responsible here, but I understand the dynamic that's making it hard.
I would also add that Congress has, as a co-equal branch of government, sort of unilaterally disarmed itself and stripped itself of its expertise and competence and kind of decision-making capability over the course of the last 40 years. When you take a look at the amount of money that's spent on staff or expertise for Congress as compared to the executive branch or even the judicial branch, it's pretty staggering.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the Dark Lord of Washington is Mitch McConnell, but the grandfather of the Dark Lord is Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich broke Congress. I mean, if there's one person that's been, I mean, he's the second most important person in the history of Congress. Madison was the first, Newt Gingrich was the second. Because Newt Gingrich radically changed the character of being a congressperson. Like he told them, don't bring your family. You're going to be working from Tuesday to Thursday. The rest of the time, he originally sold it as you'll be at home, but it turned out you'll be raising money. That's what you'll be doing. He turned them into these petty fundraisers. That's what they were doing. And at the same time, he decimated the institutional infrastructure of Congress and substituted it for lobbyists. So there used to be institutions where Congress people could, ask questions like, what is the answer to this? Now they have to ask lobbyists. And it's not an accident, because if you have to ask lobbyists, you become dependent on lobbyists. It's easier to raise money then from lobbyists. You've basically outsourced to the private sector, a very interested private sector, the job of running Congress. And so when you talk to people who've been in Congress, for a long time, so Jim Cooper went to Congress in 1980. He was elected in 1982. He spent some years back, but he's gone back. I mean, he will say it's a totally unrecognizable institution from what it was. And that dynamic, I think, I would tie it all to Newt Gingrich, and I think the consequence is exactly this self-destruction.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lessig. My name is Matt Harder. I really appreciate the reforms that you talk about. I think they're extremely important. One thing that strikes me is a major problem with getting sitting representatives to support them is that they've become expert at a certain game of gaining power, and you're recommending changing the rules of the game, which would put them at a disadvantage just by nature of the fact that they're already experts at a former way of doing it. Do you agree that that's a major hurdle? And if so, what's a way that we can actually exert pressure on sitting representatives to create these changes?
Yeah, I mean, so this kind of felt hopeful when we framed this part of the problem as the easy part. But of course, what that was hiding is that the hard part about the easy part is imagining the political will to bring about that change. Because of two things. One, they like the system. And number two, it seems really hard for politicians to focus on changing the system as the thing that they talk about first, right? It is an astonishing fact. I don't know if this is something people recognize, but there are 9 candidates running for president, remaining candidates running for president, including 3 of the top 5, who have made a commitment that they will bring fundamental reform as the first thing they will do as president. So Pete Buttigieg did this originally, said the first day I will bring fundamental reform. A bunch of groups, including Equal Citizens, but Represent Us and Citizens United, have now gotten them on the record. This is what they're going to do. So in some sense, if they did that, and the Dark Lord were in Kentucky, and they got Congress to pass something like H.R. 1, which was what Nancy Pelosi got passed, the most important reform legislation since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, public funding for elections, ending partisan gerrymandering, restoration of the Voting Rights Act, ending the revolving door, really powerful ethics, automatic voting registration, all of that in one bill. If the president were elected who had made that commitment and gets that passed, that would be an enormous change. And it's astonishing, in some conceptual sense, we're just this close to it happening, because one can at least imagine this president is not reelected, and the odds are then one of these people will be elected, and usually you get to do the first thing that, you promised. I mean, if Mexico had paid for the wall, we would have a wall along Mexico, no doubt, because that would have been what we give the president. But the problem is, it's so hard for them to talk about it. But, last night's debate was the first time the word public funding was uttered by a presidential candidate, even though 9 of them have committed to public funding. But the first time, and God bless him, Bernie Sanders, yelled it out. We were going to have public funding of campaigns. Politicians don't like to use those words. They're scary words for them to use. They get attacked. And so the dynamic of getting this into the political mix so that people understand this is what they're voting for, and then the person who gets elected has the mandate to make this happen, is the hardest part of the problem. And I'm not yet convinced that we've seen that manifest itself. I mean, Elizabeth Warren's closing was all about this. It was like, the number one problem is corruption. If we don't fix this corruption, we can't do anything else. This is the kind of gateway, not Biden's gateway, but this is the gateway to solving our problems. So she was talking the talk, but it was kind of an afterthought after a whole debate where she was talking about all the amazing things that she was going to get done, when in a certain sense we all know you're not going to get those things done until you fix this problem. So there's a really difficult political problem of how do we get them to focus enough to make this change happen, given that all the money in the world is going to be against this change happening.
Thank you.
Okay, we've only got a quick room for one more question. Sorry, Jonathan, but you'll ask afterwards, so.
Okay. Thank you and good evening. My name is Brian Cameron. I'm here in New York City as an attorney. One question that I have, of the various bar stools of this institutional problem, the one that seems to me the most intractable or the most difficult to solve might be the electoral college one, because I can't see any of the smaller states giving up their outsized influence. Certainly hope the litigation succeeds. But on the national popular vote interstate compact, a question for you is the following. I understand we're up to about 170, states with 170 votes more or less has passed it, 196 as of today. And if Virginia then jumps on board now that it's got a common legislature and governor, maybe another 13. But I read recently that there might be some constitutional infirmities with that interstate compact, but the article didn't go into say anything about what they might be. Can you shed some light on that for me?
In 3 minutes. Yeah, so 2 minutes, sorry. First, I think it's a great idea. Second, I think it will be challenged. Third, there's a structural difficulty it faces, which is it's running a national vote through 51 separate state jurisdictions. And those state jurisdictions get to draw their lines differently. So California could decide 16-year-olds get to vote. So then do the additional votes from California get counted? Of course they do. But then what does the nation begin to do when it realizes that it's got all of these separate people jigging the game to their own particular end? And if we had an election where those questions became really central, I fear it begins to unravel. Because, of course, once you've joined the compact, you can get out of the compact. So I think a long-term solution has got to focus on changing the Constitution. Now, you're right. It seems unlikely, until you begin to realize that, A, if they realize some change has got to be made, if we win our case, some change has got to be made. And secondly, the existing system doesn't benefit the small states. The swing states are not the small states. The existing swing states are, Pennsylvania, Florida, Michigan. Those are not small states. Now, it happens Iowa and New Hampshire are in that list, but that's just accidental because they're purple states. So it's not as if the existing system is doing anything anybody ever intended or wanted. The framers wanted to benefit the small states. This doesn't. This doesn't guarantee a majority win. It doesn't do any of the things they said they were doing. So there's nobody who should be committed to what we have. And I think small states should be much happier if they were allocating electors proportionally at a fractional level. They'd have a reason for presidential candidates to care. Utah would matter. Wyoming would matter, right? Because it's just as much to get a vote out of Wyoming as California. It might be cheaper because the media markets are cheaper in Wyoming. So I don't think it's as impossible as people say, but I do think we should think about how to get that solution, because as much as I support national popular vote, I'm not convinced it's stable. And that's not even talking about the constitutional challenges which you asked about.
So I just want to ask you one last question before we conclude. I feel like what your book is calling for is a dramatic revitalization of our democracy and of the way we conceptualize representation, who we are, who they are, what the civic us is. And I was looking through all of your ideas, all of the litigation that you have ongoing, and so I have a really simple question. How do you do this all? Why are you doing this all?
So, the answer is it's a pathology. Now, it's not even a funny pathology. No, I mean, here it is, really. So I started this fight a dozen years ago because a dear friend challenged me to. A kid named Aaron Swartz came to me and said, why do you think the stuff you're working on then, I was working on copyright issues, you're going to have any success so long as we have this deeply corrupted Congress? And I said to Aaron, it's not my field. And he said, as an academic, it's not your field? I said, yes, as an academic, it's not my field. He said, okay, what about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen? And I realized I couldn't say no to him at that point. You know, I had tenure. I had no reason I couldn't work on that problem. I agreed with him. It was the fundamental problem. And literally that night in December in 2006 in Berlin, I promised him I would give up the work and I would take up this challenge. And he and I started a group together. And okay, so some of you might know, how many people have heard the name Aaron Swartz? Okay. So you know that name because he tragically committed suicide. We lost him to suicide. So here's the pathology. I feel like I can't not succeed at this. Like it's, because all of, you know, the thing about suicide is it has a blast radius. And anybody within the blast radius feels responsible in some sense. And of course, I and everybody feels responsible in some sense. And so, you know, when I get up and I get on go to leave and get on my plane, and my daughter looks at me and says, "Why are you going, Dad?" And I have to really think to myself, I need to do something about this, but this is why I'm here. This is why I wrote that. This is why I'm bringing every case I can. This is why, you know, I've given 385 speeches on this issue in the last 12 years. Because he was right, and he shouldn't have been taken from us, and he was. And so, in this small way, he will inspire me until we are finished. And I hope in January 2021 we'll be finished when the next president takes up the challenge to enact fundamental reform first, and I can go back to just being a professor.
I hope not. So, thanks to you. We wish you great success with your new book. They Don't Represent Us, Reclaiming Our Democracy. I'm Brennan Center Fellow Victoria Bassetti, and on behalf of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, thank you all for coming to this program. Please keep up with the Brennan Center's work by signing up for our newsletter at brennancenter.org and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you all so much for coming.